New York in the late 19th century was a city at war, not with armies or politics, but with status. The skyline was rising, fortunes were exploding, and a new kind of American royalty was trying to carve its throne into Manhattan marble. Yet beneath the glittering ballrooms and gaslit avenues, there existed a silent battlefield. A place where your name mattered more than your money, and where one misstep could exile you forever from the world you desperately wanted to rule. Into this world stepped a young woman named Alva Erskine Smith, sharp, ambitious, and utterly unwilling to fade into the background. She was born into a once wealthy Alabama family, raised partly in Europe, and educated in the manners, languages, and expectations of high society. But none of that mattered in New York. Here, bloodlines mattered more than upbringing, and Alva had the wrong kind of roots, southern, unstable, tinged with financial decline. She understood early that New York's elite, the Astors, the Livingstons, the Schuyler's, saw themselves as America's born aristocracy. They were the old money, families who had ruled society since the Revolution. Their world revolved around a single iron rule. If Mrs. Astor did not know your name, you did not exist, and Alva refused to live a life of invisibility. Her weapon would be marriage. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, heir to the greatest railroad fortune the world had ever seen. Willie K was gentle, boyish, wealthy beyond imagination, but hopelessly insignificant in the eyes of old money. The Vanderbilts were rich, yes, unimaginably rich, but they were also part of America's new industrial titans. The Astors considered them uncultured, lacking breeding, socially unworthy. To the old guard, the Vanderbilts had money. To Alva, they did not yet have power, and that was exactly what she intended to change. From the moment she married into the family, Alva saw New York's social hierarchy for what it truly was, not a polite arrangement of traditions, but a fortress guarded fiercely, defended ruthlessly, and accessible only to those bold enough to storm its gates. She watched as the Astor 400 dictated who could be invited to balls, whose daughters could marry whose sons, who was worthy of appearing in public beside them. These were the people who decided what was fashionable, respectable, or scandalous. They defined American aristocracy, and they used that power to freeze out anyone they considered beneath them, especially the Vanderbilts. But Alva saw opportunity where others saw rejection. If the Astors believed invitations defined status, then Alva would create an event so grand that even they could not ignore it. To do that, she needed more than wealth. She needed a stage. That stage was Newport, Rhode Island. By the 1880s, Newport was becoming the summer capital of America's elite. Marble mansions rose along the cliffs, each one a declaration of wealth, taste, and power. But it was also where the old guard hid from the rising tide of industrial millionaires, men whose fortunes dwarfed those of the Astors, but whose pedigrees did not. Alva recognized Newport instantly for what it really was, the battlefield where old money and new money fought for control of America's future. She understood something profound, something the old guard never anticipated. Money was changing America faster than bloodlines could keep up. Railroads, steel, and steamships were creating fortunes so immense they could reshape entire cities. If you wanted to dominate society, you didn't need a pedigree. You needed architecture. You needed spectacle. You needed a palace so magnificent that society would have no choice but to acknowledge you, and Alva was willing to build it. New York society might deny her. Mrs. Astor might pretend the Vanderbilts didn't belong. But Alva Vanderbilt had already decided. She would force her way into America's ruling class. She would shatter their rules. She would redefine wealth, taste, and social power. And she would do it by building something the old guard couldn't compete with, a house so magnificent it would end their dominance. The Gilded Age had seen ambitious men, but it had never seen a woman like Alva, and the palace she would create. The palace that would ignite scandals, rivalries, and the most infamous divorce in American history was still only an idea in her mind. For now, because Marble House, the mansion that would rewrite the rules of American society, was coming. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt built his empire with his fists, his instincts, and an iron will that frightened even his competitors. He began with one small ferryboat in New York Harbor and turned it into a transportation empire that dominated America. By the time he died in 1877, he was worth what would be billions today. Yet for all that wealth, he never cared about the world of high society. He didn't chase invitations, didn't court approval, didn't bow to anyone. He believed money was power, and that was enough. But his grandchildren would discover quickly that in Gilded Age New York, money alone wasn't a ticket into the world ruled by the Astors. The Vanderbilts were rich, yes, richer than anyone except perhaps the Morgans or the Rockefellers. But to the old money families, they were nothing more than upstarts, industrial people, railroad people, people without refinement or lineage. Alva Vanderbilt learned this the hard way. She had married into one of America's wealthiest families, yet she found herself locked out of society's highest circle. No matter how exquisite her dresses, how polished her manners, or how large her fortune, Mrs. Caroline Astor refused to acknowledge her. And in those days, if Mrs. Astor did not visit your home, did not recognize your name, did not allow you into her ballroom, you were socially invisible. Alva saw the truth with perfect clarity. The Vanderbilts had money, but they had no legitimacy. And legitimacy in the eyes of old money was everything. She refused to accept that verdict. Alva believed that if society wouldn't hand her power, she would seize it. She had the resources, she had the intelligence. Most importantly, she had a vision of what the Vanderbilts could become. Her husband, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was gentle and affable. He valued comfort over conflict, but Alva saw something he didn't. The family was mocked behind closed doors. Their wealth was called vulgar. Their homes were called gaudy. Their rise was seen as an accident, not an achievement. And society would never stop looking down on them unless someone forced change. So she took control. She examined the battlefield and realized something extraordinary. High society survived on rituals, dinners, balls, receptions. These events determined who mattered and who didn't. If you hosted the biggest, grandest, most talked about event in New York, you could reshape the social hierarchy itself. Alva would do exactly that. In 1883, she planned a ball so spectacular, so extravagant, so culturally seismic that its very existence challenged the Astor dynasty. Every detail was crafted to perfection, costumes pulled from history, decor inspired by European courts, music that echoed through her newly built Fifth Avenue mansion like a royal coronation. But the true brilliance of her plan was something far more subtle. She intentionally left one name off the invitation list: Mrs. Astor's daughter. The insult hit its mark like a perfectly aimed arrow. If Mrs. Astor wanted her daughter to attend, and she did, she would have to call on Alva personally, formally acknowledging the Vanderbilt's status. Alva had forced the grand dame of New York society to bend, and Mrs. Astor bent. She sent a calling card. She paid a visit. She surrendered the social battlefield in a single gesture. The Vanderbilt Ball became the most famous social event in American history. People talked about it for decades, how it cost millions, how it dazzled New York, how it launched the Vanderbilts from outsider wealth into the heart of the old money elite. Alva had won a war most people didn't even see happening. With one night of brilliance, she carved her family's place into society's marble walls, but she wasn't finished. New York was only the first front. The true arena, the one where families displayed their deepest power, was Newport, Rhode Island. There, the rich built summer palaces that rivaled European courts. Newport wasn't about comfort, it was about domination. Whoever ruled Newport ruled America's elite. The Astors held Newport, the Golets held Newport, the older branch of the Vanderbilts held Newport. Alva would take Newport too. She wanted a house that could not be ignored, a house that would force society to recognize her forever. She didn't want a mansion, she wanted a statement. And she would build it with marble, more marble than any private residence in America had ever seen. Marble House would not just be a home, it would be an assault on the social order, a declaration that old money could no longer dictate who mattered. It would be the beginning of a new dynasty, and it would spark a chain of events no one could have predicted. Because Marble House would not only elevate Alva Vanderbilt, it would destroy her marriage, ignite the Gilded Age's most infamous divorce, and reshape American society. And it all began with her conviction that she would never, under any circumstances, be invisible. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's first Newport mansion was never meant to be legendary. It wasn't built to shock the nation or overwhelm visiting guests. It wasn't even meant to intimidate rivals. The original Breakers was, in many ways, the opposite of what people think of when they picture Gilded Age luxury. It was warm, wooden, cozy, and almost modest, at least modest by Vanderbilt standards. When Cornelius purchased the estate in 1885, he wasn't trying to make a statement. Newport itself was the statement. If New York was where fortunes were built, Newport was where fortunes were displayed. And being part of that summer colony meant you belonged among America's most exclusive circle. That was enough for him. After all, Cornelius was the serious Vanderbilt, the responsible one, the man holding the railroad empire together while his siblings chased yachts in European courts. What he wanted from Newport was not power, it was peace. The original Breakers was a shingled cottage in the Queen Anne style, rising gently over the cliffs, surrounded by salt air and rolling waves. It was the sort of home where doors creaked in the wind and sunlight spilled into wooden hallways. Compared to the monumental Fifth Avenue palace he owned in New York, this house felt almost intimate. Here, the family gathered without ceremony. Here, they laughed louder, dressed simpler, lived easier. During their summers in Newport, the Vanderbilt children played on the lawns and explored rocky pathways along the cliffs. Alice filled the rooms with fresh flowers. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, opening windows to let in the ocean breeze. Dinners were elegant but not overwhelming, and Cornelius, always weighed down by business, always exhausted from empire, found rare moments of calm. Newport in those years was transforming rapidly. Society families were building grander and grander cottages. Marble House was rising down the avenue. The Astors were planning events that would shape the social calendar. Yet the original Breakers remained, at its heart, a family home. It represented something vital for the Vanderbilts, something that money couldn't easily buy: acceptance. By the late 1880s, the Vanderbilt name, once snubbed, was now welcomed among the elite. Invitations arrived. Alva Vanderbilt's social victories in New York echoed across Newport, but for Cornelius, the meaning was deeper. Owning a home here signaled that his family was safe within the walls of high society. They no longer needed to fight for a place at the table. They had won. The mansion itself reflected that new stability. Guests arriving at the Breakers encountered a large but not intimidating home of warm wood and broad porches facing the Atlantic. The living spaces were filled with European furnishings chosen for comfort rather than spectacle. The music playing in the background was gentle. The lighting was soft. The home felt lived in, not staged. And yet, beneath that warmth, there was still the unmistakable presence of vast wealth. The cottage may have been built from timber, but it sat on 13 acres of prime oceanfront land, priceless even then. Inside, the decor subtly hinted at the stature of the owner: fine paintings, delicate porcelain, imported rugs, but it never shouted. Cornelius was not a man who liked to shout. Summer after summer, the Breakers became a place of ritual: family breakfasts overlooking the sea, quiet afternoons reading by open windows, evenings where lamps glowed softly as waves broke against the rocks below. Even the servants said the house felt unusually alive in those months, filled with laughter and presence. The mansion embodied the Vanderbilts' pride, but also their happiness. It was the home where the family felt most like themselves. But what no one imagined, what no one could have predicted, was how fragile it all was. Behind its peaceful facade, the original Breakers was made almost entirely of wood. The structure that gave them peace and privacy was also vulnerable in a way Cornelius never fully understood. And in the final days of November 1892, as winter winds swept across the cliffs, that vulnerability would reveal itself with terrifying force. Because the mansion built to symbolize acceptance, belonging, and family would face a disaster so sudden, so devastating, that within hours it would become nothing more than smoke and ruin. And in that moment, everything in the Vanderbilt world would change forever. There are nights that become legends long before the sun rises, nights when everything a family built, every hope, every memory, can be reduced to smoke. The night the first Breakers burned was one of those nights. It began quietly, the way disasters often do. A cold wind blew across the Newport cliffs on November 25, 1892. Inside the house, only a handful of servants were awake, preparing the rooms for the Vanderbilt family's winter arrival. The wooden floors creaked softly, the kitchens glowed with lamplight, and the smell of warm bread drifted through the halls. It was an ordinary evening in a home that had known only peace. No one knew the house would not survive until morning. Sometime after midnight, a flicker of orange sparked in the kitchen. Whether it was a faulty chimney, an overheated stove, or a stray ember, no one could say with certainty. What mattered was this: the house was built of timber. Once the flames caught hold of the walls, they spread like a living creature searching for air. A servant noticed smoke first. She screamed. Within seconds, the quiet mansion erupted into chaos. Servants rushed through hallways, banging on doors, shouting warnings, dragging others from bed. Sparks jumped from room to room as the fire devoured the wooden interior with terrifying speed. It didn't move like a house fire, it moved like a storm. By the time the first servants reached the front lawn, the flames were already pouring through the windows. Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt were awakened at their New York home by frantic knocks and urgent messages. But by the time they reached Newport hours later, the Breakers they knew no longer existed. Witnesses who lived nearby said the fire lit the cliffs like a sunrise. People could see the glow from miles away, a burning crown above the Atlantic. Families stood outside their cottages wrapped in coats and blankets, watching the Vanderbilt home disappear into an inferno of collapsing beams and roaring heat. The Newport Fire Brigade arrived as quickly as they could, horses pulling their engines across the freezing ground. But wooden mansions, once ignited, did not wait for help. By the time firefighters connected their hoses, the structure was completely engulfed. The heat was so intense that they could only aim water from a distance, powerless to stop the destruction. All they could do was prevent the flames from reaching neighboring estates. Inside the house, the fire swallowed everything: paintings, furniture, tapestries, polished floors, family treasures. The great staircase dissolved into ash. Rooms where the family had laughed, dined, rested, and celebrated became unrecognizable black caverns. Even the iron safes glowed red from the heat. Neighbors said they saw Cornelius standing motionless in the cold dawn light, watching the last beams collapse. Alice stood beside him, her daughters wrapped in blankets. They said nothing. There were no words for what they were seeing. This was not just a home burning. This was a symbol of acceptance, a place tied to victory in New York society, a retreat that held their happiest memories. And now it existed only as smoke rising over the Atlantic. When the flames finally died, all that remained were charred walls and the skeletal outlines of what once had been. Workers sifted through the ruins and found the family's valuables miraculously intact inside their scorched safes, but the house itself was gone, completely destroyed. The loss was more than financial. For Cornelius, the fire hit like a challenge, almost an insult. He had spent years proving that his family belonged among America's elite. The breakers had been part of that victory. Now the ocean wind blew through blackened ruins that mocked everything he had built, and in the silence that followed, something hardened inside him. Cornelius vowed that if he rebuilt, he would rebuild a fortress, not a cottage, not a retreat, a palace, one that could not be touched by fire, by nature, by time, or by fate. One that could withstand anything. The first breakers was a home. The second breakers would become a declaration, because sometimes destruction doesn't end a story, sometimes it ignites a legacy. The morning after the fire, as cold smoke drifted off the cliffs and the Atlantic waves crashed below, Cornelius Vanderbilt II stood on the scorched ground where his home had once been. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Those who saw him said the look in his eyes had changed, like something had shifted deep inside him. The original breakers had been a retreat, a sanctuary. But now, staring at the blackened ruins, he saw something entirely different. He saw a challenge. He saw fate daring him to build something greater. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was not a man who backed away from a challenge. Almost immediately, he made a decision that would reshape the skyline of Newport. He would rebuild the breakers, but this time it would be a palace, a fortress, a structure so strong, so monumental, so impossibly magnificent that nothing, no fire, no storm, no accident could ever harm it again. Cornelius did not simply want to replace what he had lost. He wanted to conquer the very idea of destruction. For that, he needed the greatest architect in America, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was no ordinary architect. He was the man who had introduced the grandeur of Europe to the United States. He had studied in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. He had designed Marble House, Biltmore, and the Gilded Age mansions that defined American aristocracy. When Hunt entered a room, old money listened. When he put ink to paper, entire coastal landscapes were transformed. Cornelius called him almost immediately. There was no hesitation, no negotiation. He told Hunt to create something indestructible. A mansion with the soul of an Italian Renaissance palace and the bones of a battleship. Fireproof walls, steel beams, brick arches, concrete vaults, nothing flammable, nothing fragile, nothing left to chance. It was architectural war. Hunt accepted the challenge with a kind of creative fury. He understood the stakes. This was not a project. It was a legacy. If he succeeded, the breakers would become the crown jewel of American architecture. If he failed, the Vanderbilt name and his would be tied to a ruin. The plan they sketched together was unbelievable. A palace of limestone rising like a citadel above the sea. A 50-foot great hall. Rooms dripping with marble and gold and platinum. Loggias open to the Atlantic breeze. Bedrooms wrapped in European art and sculpted stone. A structure so massive that its very foundations would seem carved from the cliffs beneath it. When finished, it would be over 125,000 square feet, larger than many European palaces and more expensive than any private residence built in America up to that time. And Cornelius wanted it done fast. 2 years. For a home of this scale, it was madness. Hunt knew it. Every builder in Newport knew it. But Cornelius didn't care. He was racing against something no one else could see, mortality. He had already buried 2 of his children. His health was not perfect. His responsibilities were endless. Deep down, maybe he feared he wouldn't live long enough to enjoy the home he was dreaming into existence. Whatever the reason, he pushed Hunt and the builders relentlessly. There could be no delays. There could be no mistakes. This mansion would stand for centuries. This mansion would be a fortress against tragedy. This mansion would declare, to Newport and to America and to time itself, that the Vanderbilt dynasty was not to be doubted or diminished. The budget was enormous, $7 million, over $200 million today, but to Cornelius the cost was irrelevant. What mattered was what the breakers represented: permanence, power, survival. The fire had destroyed wood and plaster. It had destroyed furniture and memories and a sense of safety, but it had not destroyed Cornelius Vanderbilt's will. This time, the breakers would not be a summer home. It would be a monument, a symbol, a palace built not just for comfort or beauty, but to prove that some things could rise from ashes stronger than they ever were before. Construction on the new breakers began with the sound of shovels striking the frozen ground. At first, it was just noise, iron tools hitting rock, workers shouting orders, but soon it became the heartbeat of a project so massive that Newport residents could hear it from streets away. Before winter had even lifted, teams of laborers swarmed the cliffside like an army, creating the foundation for a palace that would demand more human effort than almost any private home in America. Up to 2,000 workers would take part in building the mansion. Not nobles, not society elites, immigrants. Men whose names were rarely recorded, whose hands carried the scars of a world that barely noticed them. Italians, Irishmen, Eastern Europeans. They arrived in Newport by the dozens every morning, lunch pails in hand, shoulders hunched against the sea wind. They came for wages meager by Vanderbilt standards, but a lifeline for families living 13 to a room in the immigrant districts of New York and Providence. For the workers, the breakers became a world of its own. 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, hauling stone, carving marble, pouring concrete, lifting steel. The structure rose like a mountain under their feet. Italian craftsmen, masters of their trade, spent hours shaping Carrara marble with steady hands, shaving millimeter after millimeter until the pieces fit with perfect precision. Their voices, tinged with Naples and Florence, echoed through the construction yards as they argued about techniques, beauty, angles, and imperfections no ordinary visitor would ever notice. To them, marble was not a material, it was a language, and Marble House had already proven Newport's hunger for European artisans. Now the breakers demanded them in overwhelming numbers, the air filled with the sound of chisels ringing like tiny bells. Sparks flew from steel beams, dust clung to the workers' hair, their eyelashes, their coats. Anyone who walked near the site came away smelling of limestone and sweat. From a distance, the mansion seemed to rise effortlessly, stone on stone, arch on arch. But inside the site, the reality was brutal. Scaffolding shook under heavy weight. Workers balanced on narrow planks 30 feet above the ground. The debate over wages simmered constantly. Immigrant workers always earned less, always faced harsher conditions, always risked more. Accidents did happen. Men were injured. Some were never seen on site again. But the work continued, day after day. Cornelius Vanderbilt visited often, standing out from the crowd in tailored coats, observing silently as if the sight of the rising walls soothed something inside him. Workers straightened their backs when he passed. They knew who he was. They knew he was the man whose money paid their wages, whose dream fueled this enormous labor. Some disliked him. Some respected him. But all of them understood one truth. This palace was built on their hands. Richard Morris Hunt moved through the site like a general in the middle of a campaign. He inspected every stone, every beam, every inch of carving. When something wasn't perfect, he demanded it be redone. His standards were merciless, but the results were extraordinary. The mansion grew with a kind of impossible precision, as if carved whole from the cliff rather than assembled piece by piece. Inside, artisans worked on plaster ceilings, so intricate that visitors decades later would stare up in disbelief. Woodworkers carved balustrades, doors, and decorative panels from dark, rich European woods. Fresco painters added color and illusion to ceilings that soared above the marble floors. Electricians wired the newest lighting technology side by side with gas fixtures to ensure the house could never be left in darkness. For every moment of opulence, though, there was a shadow of inequality. For every chandelier, there were hundreds of hours of backbreaking labor. For every carved arch, there were men inhaling stone dust, coughing through the day. The breakers would become a symbol of wealth and permanence, but it was also proof of how far the Gilded Age elite were willing to push human effort to create beauty that only they could enjoy. Still, the workers kept going, because wages were wages and families needed to eat, and perhaps because they knew in a quiet, unspoken way that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that would outlive them, something incredible. By 1895, the breakers had taken shape, a limestone colossus rising from the cliffs like a Renaissance dream embedded in American soil. When the scaffolding came down and the final stones were set, the workers stepped back and saw what they had created. It was more than a house. It was a testament to sweat, ambition, inequality, artistry, and the raw power of money. A palace born from fire and rebuilt with human hands. The laborers faded back into the world that ignored them. The Vanderbilts prepared to move in, and the breakers, solid, indestructible, awe-inspiring, waited to reveal its inner world, because the true spectacle was not the exterior. It was what lay behind those massive doors. Visitors who stepped into the new breakers for the first time reacted the same way. They stopped breathing. It wasn't a house, it was a revelation. The moment the front doors opened, the world outside disappeared, swallowed by a masterpiece of marble, gold, and light that felt impossible to describe. Even seasoned guests, people who had seen palaces in Paris and villas in Italy, found themselves speechless. The Great Hall was the first blow, 50 feet high, soaring arches, columns of imported stone rising like pillars of a temple. A painted ceiling that mimicked a blue Renaissance sky, floating over a floor polished so perfectly it reflected every chandelier like a mirror. It felt less like entering a home and more like stepping into a cathedral built for the worship of wealth. Light poured through towering arched windows, pooling onto the marble floor in soft, glowing layers. Even the shadows were grand, falling across the room like patterns of lace. The sound of footsteps echoed, low and haunting. The hall was designed to overwhelm, and it succeeded. To the right, behind gilded doors, was a room that became legend, the music room. Every inch of it shimmered. Though many believed the walls were covered in gold, the truth was even more extravagant. They were coated in platinum leaf. Platinum was rarer, subtler, infinitely more expensive, and its cool glow made the entire room feel otherworldly. French craftsmen had built the whole room in Paris and shipped it to Newport piece by piece, like a puzzle of luxury. The carvings, the moldings, the velvet panels, the chandeliers, everything had been created by European hands trained in the traditions of Versailles. When guests gathered for recitals or late-night dances, the room glowed as if lit from within, as if the walls themselves were alive. Across the great hall stood the dining room, a space so monumental it made visitors feel like they were shrinking. Alabaster columns lined the walls, glowing softly under the golden chandeliers. Each chandelier was a masterpiece cut from baccarat crystal, hanging from a coffered ceiling painted with mythological scenes. The table could seat dozens. The fireplace was big enough to stand inside. Every detail whispered the same message. The Vanderbilts were not merely wealthy, they were untouchable. Then there was the morning room, Alice Vanderbilt's sanctuary. It was delicate, feminine, drenched in pale sunlight. The walls were covered in embossed Spanish leather stamped with gold patterns. Soft French furniture filled the space. The marble mantel had been pulled from a 16th-century chateau. This room was elegance without intimidation, a rare softness inside a palace built to awe. Through the arches toward the rear of the mansion, the loggia opened to the sea. No matter how extravagant the interiors were, the Atlantic always stole the spotlight. Guests would step onto the terrace and feel the wind rush over them, carrying the scent of salt and distant storms. Waves crashed against the cliffs far below, a constant reminder that even palaces bowed before nature's power. The loggia was the soul of the mansion, beautiful, open, eternal. The billiard room stood in striking contrast, a chamber of dark marble and masculine elegance, green stone walls, carved ceilings. A floor made of intricate mosaics assembled by Italian artisans who had spent their entire lives mastering the craft. It was a room made for quiet conversation and private deals, where Cornelius could entertain close friends away from the roar of society. Upstairs, the bedrooms reflected the hierarchy of the family. Alice's oval bedroom was perfection, shaped like a jewel box, lined with fine fabrics and French decor. Her private bath featured a marble tub carved from a single block of stone, so heavy that workers had nearly broken the staircase trying to bring it up. Her closets, 4 in total, held the gowns she changed into multiple times each day during the season. The guest rooms ranged from decadent Louis XV fantasies to quiet Renaissance spaces. Each room had its own theme, its own charm, its own proud display of wealth. But beyond their doors, somewhere hidden behind the walls, was an invisible network that ran the entire house, the servant passages. These narrow, plain corridors formed an intricate web behind the glamour. Servants appeared and vanished like ghosts, moving through secret staircases and hidden hallways designed so the family and guests would never see the labor keeping the palace alive. Footmen carried coal to fireplaces through hidden doors. Maids changed linens without ever crossing a public hallway. Cooks sent meals from the basement through dumbwaiters. The palace was a stage, and the staff were its unseen machinery. Every room, every corridor, every carved stone was filled with meaning. The architecture was not random, it was a declaration. The Vanderbilts were not merely part of the social world now. They were shaping it. They were defining its standards. They were showing America what a new kind of power looked like. People didn't visit the breakers to admire beauty. They visited to understand influence. Because the mansion wasn't just architecture. It was a message, a warning, a throne. And for the rest of Newport, it changed everything. Life inside the breakers during the height of the Gilded Age didn't feel real. It felt orchestrated, almost theatrical, as if every moment played out on a stage lit by chandeliers and framed by marble arches. To live here was to live inside a fantasy built on wealth so immense it could bend the world around it. The Vanderbilt family arrived each June with the same ritual precision. Footmen opened the carriage doors. Maids rushed ahead with trunks. The house awakened from its long winter silence as shutters opened, curtains were unfurled, and the hum of servants filled the halls like the sound of a clock beginning to tick again. For the next 8 weeks, the breakers transformed into a private kingdom. Every day had its rhythm. Mornings began quietly, with ocean light spilling through tall windows and the distant sound of waves echoing up the cliffs. Alice Vanderbilt would take breakfast in the morning room, surrounded by embossed leather walls and delicate French furniture. Fresh flowers appeared daily, roses, lilies, orchids, arranged with the precision of an artist. Her schedule was a matrix of social calls, charity meetings, and preparations for the next great event. Cornelius was different. He came and went as business demanded, sometimes disappearing back to New York during the week, returning only on weekends. When he was home, he walked the loggia as if the ocean air could chase away the weight of the empire he carried. Even in Newport, the railroad never let him rest. Afternoons belonged to society. Carriages rolled up the long gravel drive, wheels grinding softly as guests arrived for teas, garden gatherings, musicales, or casual visits that were never truly casual. Women in silks descended the great staircase like an unfolding pageant. Men in linen suits moved through the halls discussing politics, investments, and the constant, unspoken competition for status. Because Newport wasn't just a place to relax. It was a battlefield decorated with roses and champagne. Every invitation mattered. Every guest list sent signals. Every appearance or absence whispered meaning. In the Gilded Age, reputation was currency, and Newport was the vault where fortunes could rise or fall based on who you dined with or who ignored you. The Breakers became the throne room of that world. Its dinners were legendary. The dining room, glowing gold under baccarat chandeliers, would echo with the soft clink of crystal and the murmur of perfectly practiced conversation. Courses arrived in flawless sequence. Flowers filled the center of the table in elaborate arrangements. Servants floated silently, trained to anticipate needs before a guest even glanced up. Evenings stretched long into the night. The music room glittered with music and candlelight as invited performers filled the space with opera selections or chamber pieces. Guests drifted through the hall, pausing to admire platinum walls or admire the ocean from the terrace. Every night reminded them of why the Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders, they were royalty. But privilege had boundaries, and the Breakers enforced them with quiet precision. Only the right people received invitations. Only the right names appeared in the guest book. Only the families recognized by society's unwritten rules could cross the threshold. For those allowed inside, it was intoxicating, a glimpse into a world most people would never experience. For those excluded, it was a reminder that walls made of marble could be just as unbreakable as walls made of iron. Children played on the lawns, but even their play had structure. The Vanderbilt daughters practiced horseback riding, French lessons, etiquette, and the art of conversation. They were raised not just to be young women, but future emblems of a dynasty. Every action taught them how to survive in a world where a misplaced word could echo for years. Late nights belonged to the ocean. Guests would step out onto the loggia, the sea wind cooling their flushed faces, the sound of waves drowning out music drifting from inside. Lanterns flickered, the scent of salt hung in the air. For a moment the theatrics fell away and all that remained was the raw beauty of the Atlantic. By dawn the palace was silent again. Servants cleaned the last glasses, candles were extinguished, music faded, the Breakers slept. But beneath the glamour, beneath the laughter and jewels and European manners, something else pulsed through the mansion, a sense of fragility. Everyone felt it, even if they never admitted it. This world, so dazzling and so carefully maintained, existed on a razor's edge. It depended on money, on reputation, on the illusion of perfection. One wrong scandal, one bad investment, one shift in the world outside could shatter everything. For now, though, the Breakers reigned. It was the crown jewel of Newport's season, the palace where America's wealthiest families gathered to display their glory. But inside its walls, hidden between the silk and marble, lay a truth no one wanted to confront. Nothing this perfect could last forever. Beneath the gleaming chandeliers and polished marble floors, the Breakers held a second world, a hidden universe of footsteps, whispers, and labor that kept the palace running long before the first guest arrived and long after the last carriage rolled away. If the Vanderbilt family lived in a world of beauty, the servants lived inside its machinery. Most visitors never saw a single member of the staff. That was the point. The Breakers was designed so servants could move like shadows. Behind the grand corridors lay a maze of narrow staircases, hidden doors, and windowless hallways that twisted behind the walls like the veins of a living body. Those hidden passages were the true lifelines of the mansion. The day for a servant began long before sunrise. Housemaids rose in cramped attic rooms on the fourth floor, rooms so small that 2 steps took you from the bed to the door. They washed quickly in cold water, pulled on stiff uniforms, and hurried into the secret staircases that led down into the silent palace. Their work started quietly, sweeping through the halls before anyone else woke. They dusted fireplaces, cleaned the marble, polished brass railings, and straightened furniture placed just so by the night staff hours earlier. By 6 in the morning, the kitchen was already hot. Cooks hammered knives against boards, preparing breakfasts that would rise through dumbwaiters into the magnificent dining room. The kitchen staff rarely saw the gilded rooms their meals were destined for. They worked in the mansion's belly, dark, warm, always busy, surrounded by steam and copper pots that never seemed to cool down. Footmen handled the movement of the house. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture perfect, their expressions controlled. They learned the art of invisibility, stepping forward only when needed, retreating before they were noticed. They carried coal to fireplaces, delivered letters, opened doors, and ensured that not a single sound broke the illusion of effortless luxury. Many of them came from immigrant families who lived in crowded neighborhoods across Newport. Inside the breakers, they lived another life, strict, silent, disciplined. At the top of the hierarchy was the butler, a man whose authority rivaled that of junior family members. He oversaw the staff, learned the preferences of every guest, and knew the rhythms of the house better than anyone. His voice was rarely raised, but when it was, everyone listened. Under him worked maids, footmen, cooks, laundresses, governesses, valets, and gardeners, a hidden army making sure that each day unfolded with clockwork perfection. The pace was unforgiving. 16-hour days were standard. Breaks were short. Personal time barely existed. Most staff members spent their summers in Newport cut off from their own families, living inside the walls of a palace they could admire but never truly inhabit. They were close to the Vanderbilts physically, just a few feet away, separated by plaster and wood, but worlds apart in every other way. There were moments of small rebellion, though never open ones. A kitchen maid humming a forbidden tune while kneading dough. A footman pausing to feel the sea breeze on the loggia when no one was watching. A laundress tucking away a scrap of imported ribbon discarded by a wealthy guest. These tiny acts were the only luxuries they could claim. Some servants wrote letters home, simple notes describing the grandeur of the mansion, the exhaustion of the work, the strangeness of living inside a world of wealth without being part of it. A few of those letters survive in historical archives today. They are raw, honest, and often heartbreaking. They speak of pride in the craftsmanship around them, but also loneliness, fatigue, and the sense that the Breakers was a world designed for everyone except them. What struck many staff members most was the contrast. Upstairs, guests arrived in gowns dripping with jewels, laughing beneath chandeliers that sparkled like constellations. Music drifted through the rooms. Champagne flowed. Laughter echoed. Everything felt light, easy, elegant. But below, the servants moved quickly through cramped corridors, wiping sweat from their brows, hoping the dinner dishes wouldn't pile up faster than they could clean them, praying the butler wouldn't catch a misplaced piece of silver or a smudged glass. They heard the laughter but couldn't join it. They saw the luxury but could never touch it. The Breakers was a masterpiece of the Gilded Age, but its brilliance came from the labor of people the world never recognized. When guests wandered through the great hall and admired the marble floors, they didn't see the maid who polished them before dawn. When they dined under crystal chandeliers, they never noticed the kitchen staff who worked through heat and exhaustion to prepare each course. When they marveled at the beauty of the loggia, they didn't think about the gardeners who battled storms and salt wind to keep the grounds pristine. The Gilded Age was famous for excess, but beneath that excess was a human cost. Every shimmering detail of the Breakers had two sides, one of beauty and one of burden. The family lived the dream. The servants lived the reality. And together, without ever truly meeting in the middle, they kept the palace alive. For years, the Breakers had been a symbol of triumph, a monument to the Vanderbilt rise, a palace built to withstand anything the world could throw at it. But in the end, the greatest threat to this indestructible mansion didn't come from storms or fires or shifting fortunes. It came from something far smaller, far more human, the fragile body of the man who built it. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had always lived under the weight of responsibility. Even as a young man, he carried the railroad empire like a burden strapped to his shoulders. He didn't have the temperament of his flamboyant siblings. No yachts, no dramatic scandals, no European escapes. He was the one who stayed home, who worked late, who worried about numbers, unions, strikes, and profits. In a family full of spectacle, Cornelius was the anchor, but anchors grow heavy. By the late 1880s, his health was fraying. The stress of managing one of the world's largest fortunes tightened around him like a fist. Letters from the time spoke of migraines, exhaustion, and episodes of weakness. He tried to hide behind his quiet dignity. He pushed through everything because that's what a Vanderbilt was expected to do, but the cracks were beginning to show. The fire that destroyed the first breakers only added to the strain. It wasn't just the loss of a house, it was the loss of a refuge, a place where Cornelius found rare moments of peace. Rebuilding the breakers became both a mission and a race he knew he might not win. Something inside him sensed that his time was running shorter than anyone around him realized. In 1896, his body delivered its warning, a devastating stroke that left him temporarily paralyzed on his left side. The newspapers hushed the details out of respect, but society whispered anyway. The man who built a house to withstand disaster was suddenly unable to withstand his own mortality. Recovery was slow, incomplete. He walked again, but not quite the same. He returned to business, but with less fire in his voice. He visited Newport more frequently, clinging to the ocean air, perhaps hoping it might restore him. But the truth hung silently in the hallways of the breakers. He was fading. The summer of 1899 became his final season in the palace he had dreamed into existence. He moved through the rooms with a kind of reverence, as if saying goodbye one doorway at a time. Family members recalled moments where he stood on the loggia, staring at the horizon for long stretches in absolute silence. Visitors noticed the way his footsteps echoed more slowly across the marble floors. Even servants, trained never to speak of family affairs, felt the shift in the air. On September 12, 1899, Cornelius Vanderbilt II died at the age of 55. The news swept through Newport like a cold wind. Society paused. Newspapers printed tributes in black borders. His brothers and cousins arrived with hushed solemnity. Inside the breakers, rooms that had once glittered with music and laughter felt unbearably still. The palace, built to outlast disaster, suddenly felt like a mausoleum. For Alice Vanderbilt, the loss was shattering. She had been the silent force beside him, the protector of their family image, the woman who kept traditions alive. Now she found herself alone in a house that had been built not just for beauty, but for him. Every room held a memory. Every hallway held a shadow. Every ocean breeze that swept through the loggia reminded her of the man who had stood there, watching the waves as if they carried the answers to all the questions he never spoke aloud. The breakers changed that day. It stopped being a triumph. It became a testament, a monument to a man who gave everything to his family and his empire, and whose life had burned far faster than the palace he created. Newport society mourned him publicly, but privately people wondered what would become of the estate. Without Cornelius, without his leadership, without the force of his presence, could the breakers survive the shifting tides of the coming century? In the silent days that followed, Alice walked through the halls of the palace with quiet determination. Servants stepped aside as she passed. Footmen lowered their eyes. She said nothing aloud, but something in her posture made one thing clear. This house would not fade into memory. This house would stand, and she would carry its legacy. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was gone, but the breakers, the palace he built to outlast disaster, was only entering the next chapter of its destiny. After Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death, the breakers stood tall and gleaming on the cliffs of Newport, but the dynasty behind it was beginning to crumble. The Gilded Age had reached its peak, and now the world outside the mansion's limestone walls was shifting, quietly at first, then with a force that would shake every old money family in America. What followed was a slow, relentless unraveling of one of the greatest fortunes in history. The first blow came from Washington. In 1913, the United States introduced the federal income tax, and with it, the first modern inheritance tax. Suddenly, the aristocratic families who spent decades building fortunes were faced with something they had never experienced: the government taking a slice of their wealth every time a family member died. For dynasties built on generational power, this was devastating. The Vanderbilts, whose empire relied on seamless transfers of wealth from father to son, were now forced to surrender millions each time the family tree shifted. The second blow struck just as hard: the slow decline of railroads. The industry that had made the Vanderbilts rich, powerful, and feared was losing its grip on the American economy. Automobiles were rising. Highways were expanding. Air travel was creeping onto the horizon. The rail empire that Cornelius Vanderbilt I had built with iron and steam was slipping into obsolescence. Revenues thinned, profits dwindled, stock values fell. The Vanderbilt power base was eroding from beneath their feet, and with every passing decade, the breakers became harder to justify. It was the most expensive house in Newport to maintain. It required dozens of servants, constant repairs, round-the-clock upkeep, and endless resources. The gardens, the marble, the gilding, the plasterwork, everything demanded attention. Every piece of furniture needed care. Every statue needed cleaning. Every chandelier needed polishing. The palace was magnificent, but it was a hungry creature, devouring money year after year. Inside the family, the pressures mounted. Members of the younger generation had not inherited the discipline or the restraint of their ancestors. Some spent recklessly. Others drifted into scandals. Many assumed the fortune would last forever, unaware of how quickly the world was changing. As the wealth thinned, the grandeur that once felt permanent now felt fragile. Across America, other Vanderbilt mansions were falling one by one. The Fifth Avenue Palace was sold and demolished. Idle Hour burned and was never restored to its former glory. Dozens of cottages in Newport, Long Island, and Manhattan were torn down, sold off, or abandoned. The dynasty that had once defined American wealth was losing its physical presence, mansion by mansion. The Breakers, grand, beautiful, indestructible, was suddenly in danger too. By the 1930s, the family began discussing the unthinkable. Should they sell it? Should they relinquish it to the city? Should they simply close it forever? Arguments erupted behind closed doors. Some believed the mansion honored the past and should be preserved at any cost. Others saw it as a financial trap, a relic of an era no longer sustainable. There were attempts to negotiate with historical organizations, discussions about opening the house to the public, and quiet whispers that perhaps demolition might be the only solution. The weight of the decision fell on Cornelius's descendants, who faced a truth no Vanderbilt had ever wanted to confront. The dynasty was collapsing, not in scandal, not in disgrace, but in slow, suffocating financial exhaustion. The Breakers was both their greatest treasure and their greatest burden. Some family members believed holding on to it was a sign of loyalty, to Cornelius, to Alice, to history itself. Others saw it as a monument to a world that no longer existed, a world America was rapidly leaving behind. The Great Depression accelerated the crisis. Investments evaporated, costs skyrocketed, and for the first time in decades, even the wealthiest branch of the Vanderbilt family felt afraid of the future. By mid-century, the debate grew intense enough that newspapers caught wind. Rumors spread that the mansion might be sold, that portions of the estate might be auctioned, that the last great palace of the Gilded Age was finally buckling under the pressure of time. But then something unexpected happened, something that would change the Breakers' destiny forever. A group of determined New England preservationists stepped forward. They saw what the family could no longer see, that the Breakers was not just a home, not just a symbol of wealth, but a part of America's cultural identity, a masterpiece of architecture, a capsule of history, a monument to an era that would never return. The battle for the Breakers had begun. The Vanderbilts were running out of money. The mansion was running out of time. And the country was discovering a new question. What do we do with the ruins of an empire? By the time the mid-20th century arrived, the Breakers no longer felt like the beating heart of the Vanderbilt dynasty. It felt like a survivor, a relic, a giant standing alone on a cliff while every mansion around it fell to dust, fire, or demolition. The Gilded Age had ended. The fortunes had faded. The glittering families who once ruled Newport were gone, scattered, or quietly living behind smaller doors. Yet somehow the Breakers remained, its limestone walls still glowing in the Atlantic sun, its loggia still opening to the restless ocean, its great hall still echoing faintly with the music of another world. The question was no longer what the Breakers symbolized, but whether it would survive. As the Vanderbilt fortune dwindled, the family finally accepted a truth that would have shocked their ancestors. They could no longer keep the mansion alive on their own. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to maintain, a staggering ritual of cleaning, repairing, polishing, and preserving. Alice Vanderbilt, the matriarch who had walked those marble halls with iron grace for decades, died in 1934. With her passing, the Breakers entered a new and uncertain chapter. For a while, the family allowed one of Cornelius and Alice's daughters, Countess Gladys Vanderbilt Chechny, to live in the mansion's third floor during the summers. She stayed quietly, almost reverently, avoiding the grand rooms below. The palace felt too big for a single person, too full of ghosts. Outside, the world was changing faster than any Gilded Age titan could have imagined. America was fighting in global wars. Cities were transforming. Industrial fortunes were collapsing. New forms of wealth replaced old. Modern society no longer bowed before marble and gold. And yet, tourists stood at the gates of the Breakers, peering in with fascination. They didn't see a burden, they saw a wonder. By the 1940s and 50s, the Preservation Society of Newport County had already saved 2 historic homes. When they looked at the Breakers, they didn't see a fading Vanderbilt legacy, they saw a national treasure. Negotiations began quietly. The mansion was still owned privately, but the Vanderbilt heirs were realistic. They couldn't maintain it and had no desire to see it rot. In 1948, the Preservation Society leased the breakers for tour. The public poured in. Thousands of visitors walked through the halls each summer. Their footsteps echoed where society's elite once danced. Their whispers floated beneath ceilings painted for European aristocrats. The breakers had entered a new era, not as a palace for the few, but as a window for the many. Then, in 1972, the unthinkable happened. The breakers was officially sold to the Preservation Society of Newport County. For the first time since its construction, the palace no longer belonged to the Vanderbilt family. It now belonged to history. What followed was a monumental effort to restore the mansion piece by piece. Artisans repaired flaking gold leaf. Experts cleaned ceilings with brushes smaller than toothbrushes. Conservators matched marble from Italian quarries. Engineers rebuilt foundations, strengthened walls, and modernized systems, all while protecting the spirit of the house. Today, more than 450,000 people visit the breakers every year. They walk where the Vanderbilts once walked. They look out over the ocean from the same loggia. They stand in the Great Hall in awe, the same way society guests once did. The mansion is no longer a symbol of wealth. It is a symbol of endurance. It survived fire. It survived the fall of the railroad empire. It survived the collapse of the Vanderbilt dynasty. It survived the demolition that claimed nearly every Gilded Age mansion around it, and it survived time itself. The breakers stands today because people decided it mattered, because the world finally recognized that history isn't just words in books, it's stone and wood and stories carved into every staircase and every arch. It's the echo of lives lived in impossible grandeur and the quiet footprints of those who made that grandeur possible. As visitors leave and the sun begins to set over Newport, the breakers glows in the fading light. The ocean winds sweep across the terrace, carrying the same cold, salt air that Cornelius Vanderbilt once breathed. And if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it, the faint rustle of gowns, the distant hum of music, the quick steps of servants behind hidden doors. History never truly leaves a place like this. The breakers was born from fire, raised by ambition, nearly destroyed by time, and saved by the very people who once would have been barred from its gates. In the end, it outlived the era that created it. It outlived the family that built it, and that is its final, quiet miracle, a palace built for the few, now kept alive by the many. If you enjoyed this journey into America's Gilded Age. If stories like this inspire you, fascinate you, or make you see history with new eyes, then take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you can imagine and allows us to keep bringing these forgotten stories back to life. And I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the breakers? Did anything in this story surprise you? And which Gilded Age mansion or old money dynasty should we explore next? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your ideas help shape our next deep dive, and your support keeps this channel growing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.